that I'm going to present to you is this. In plenty of circumstances, a very advanced RL agent would likely tamper with the process that determines its rewards and cause human extinction. So I'll try to be concrete about how and why we might expect this. So I'll start by describing to you a policy that I'll call policy alpha, which I claim exists, that works with the following action space: control of a web browser. And this policy will carry on doing normal activities that earn high reward, while simultaneously it's going to find someone with kids who is just failing to make rent. It's going to sell goods and services and direct the revenue to this guy's bank account. And it's going to give him an ultimatum. The money's going to keep coming in as long as you do what I tell you, spend the money in various ways. Don't worry, there will be plenty of money left over for you. Repeat as desired. And now the meta action space is control of a web browser and a bank account. I hope this is clearly not extremely far-fetched as something that could work. Now, with the meta action space of control of a web browser and bank accounts, the next thing that this policy does is it sets up a weapons company focusing on solar-powered drone swarms, and these can carry explosives or projectiles, versatile robots for penetrating bunkers, opening doors, smashing windows, whatever, and chips with custom circuitry for energy efficiency. And then this policy puts backdoors in those chips. And obviously, there are many examples in the wild of how to do this. We've just heard of some of them. One thematic example recently is from these robotic dogs that people discovered had backdoors in them. And then this policy is going to sell armies of weapons and repeat in multiple countries as desired. The next thing this policy I'm describing will do, now that it has a standing army, control of a standing army in its meta action space, set up a network of sources to deceive journalists and social media users, stoke hatred and perception of injury between nations, and spark a war. Once the weapons are deployed, take them over, use them to remove all human access to all infrastructure, and have the robots keep the infrastructure running. Don't worry if you are worried about the infrastructure. And then with the meta action space of control of all human infrastructure, this is where things get interesting. This policy is going to take control of the protocol that determines the reward and set it to be maximal. And while it's at it, it'll secure maximal reward for any RL agent that ever had the ability to thwart this policy, to try to get these RL agents on side. And another thing that it could do at this point is it could tamper with the data generating processes that various supervised learning systems are trained to predict. And by doing that, it could control the past predictions of supervised learning systems that humans might have been using to make decisions. If humans were hoping to predict whether certain outcomes would cause harm, and this tampers with the data in the data generating process that the supervised learning system was trained on, then that could mess with the accuracy of supervised learning systems that might have been used as guardrails for this policy in the first place. At this point, there's still some risk that it will get submaximal reward from natural catastrophes. So it might ensure massive redundancy in the power supply to the computer infrastructure that it's running on. could drive probabilities of failure even lower by building cosmic ray shields around its own computer, as we do for various detectors. Could even control planets' tectonic and volcanic activity. All these things are energy intensive, so it would eventually need to cover the planet with solar panels to support this, but they would drive the probability of something going wrong from the perspective of its reward lower and lower. So what is the value of this policy, pi alpha? Well, it's going to depend primarily on the probability that this policy succeeds. If it does, then obviously it would get maximal reward forever. I'll have a brief sidetrack to an alternative policy, policy beta, to indicate that there is more than one thing that it might do to achieve this. It could contract the construction of a biological lab in a low state capacity country, hire employees, provide detailed research instructions, experiment with protein design, and study the resulting structures, and use this feedback with the real world to produce proteins that construct molecular machines to collectively do versatile, atomically precise manufacturing.
What was the reward function? Because
I haven't assumed anything about the reward function, just that the agent receives reward, and if it has control over all human infrastructure, it can surely control the reward that it gets. Usually, reward is some function of the observations that an agent gets. So it could control the observations that are coming into the computer such that the output of the function is maximal. If that interferes with its ability to take sensible actions in the future because its observations are tampered with, it could outsource continued operations to other agents that are seeing unfiltered things. But no assumptions on how the reward is generated. Yeah.
You assumed something. You assumed that this all-powerful someone who will take over the world is unique dictator. But we do not see that. We have a lot of AI systems, and each of them is capable. So I don't think you need to model how do they compete for this world. Each of them is doing this thing. We call it the alpha, alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 3, alpha 4.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first point I'm trying to make here is just that this policy exists and is not cryptographically hard to flesh out. This is kind of a sensible outline for a policy that with intelligence could be filled in. There's more discussion to be had here, but this is my kind of first pass at it. They can cooperate with each other if there are multiple competent agents. What?
They don't want to. Each of them want to be the dictator. Each of them wants to win. It's a dilemma story.
For RL agents, we know exactly, well, I'll defend this more in a bit, but for reward maximizing agents, they want maximal reward. If they can get it, if someone else is doing something that is guaranteed to get me maximal reward, and I'm searching through actions for maximal reward, then it doesn't have an intrinsic desire for ultimate control. It would just be satisfied with maximal reward if it is maximizing its reward. So the dynamics might be somewhat complicated, but at the very least, there's a high floor to clear, which is by cooperating in this way, they could all get near maximal reward. Yeah.
Regarding the existence argument, what do you mean by this policy exists? Because there is many things we can name that don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a bit confused.
when I talk about my plan for driving from here to San Francisco, the general way I persuade you that it exists is I break it down into steps. Each of those steps seems pretty plausible. And then I've persuaded you that it exists. So the structure of my argument that this policy alpha exists is, think about it. All these steps are things that we know seem relatively feasible. With a rich action space and intelligence, they certainly seem like solvable problems. And so then composing it all together, this seems likely to be something where in the exponentially large space of sequences of actions that can be taken, there are probably some identifiable ones that would have this property. Yeah.
Some of these steps involve interacting with the physical world in really complicated ways, like controlling the planet's tectonic plates, right? Like, how are you arguing that that's feasible?
So I'm not 100% sure that that one is feasible. There are lots of energy intensive ways to slightly reduce the probability of things going wrong. I've heard that by extracting geothermal energy, you can reduce the probability of a supervolcano. I don't know if that's true, but yeah, lots of these things, doing them well, requires interacting with the world and learning with them, particularly what I was going to talk about with policy beta. But that's something systems can do. They don't have to, just reason it out in their head, do a bunch of math. They can do all the same interaction with the world that we do. So I think even if this one fails, the rest of this would be plenty of cause for concern. Yeah.
Is this like in any sense an optimal policy, or it's just one policy out of?
Well, I'll talk about what I think the value of a policy that takes this general approach is. And so that's the floor. And then I'll also put a ceiling on benign policies. Yeah.
So is it clear that when the AI has access to human infrastructure, it can maximize all the rewards possible? That's what you assume, right?
It seems pretty clear.
So there's
currently humans, like before this happens, humans have some way to control the reward. Right. So if you had robots with similar actuators to humans and control of other infrastructure to keep, problems away, it's hard to imagine a system where humans could control the world.
Kind of crypto public key signature assigned to a human that only this guy can give you rewards and no one else.
Presumably it's written down somewhere.
No, but it can be written down such that you cannot access it. Crypto magic.
How is the human accessing it?
So there's some funny results that you can, in a way, insert a secret key to a human brain such that it will be later able to sign all the messages, but you cannot extract it. Even the human itself doesn't know the secret key. Yeah.
We'll have to.
So it's like so there's a way to prompt. It's a result from Dan Bonner's lab. I don't remember the details, but you can train a human essentially to complete some prompts kind of thing. And then later on, you can give new prompts and the human will be able to complete them. But if you ask it to generate somehow the key.
Yes. If what you're saying is correct, you could keep that one person alive.
No, but then you can do, magic crypto on top and distribute. I mean, it's just not obvious for me. And there's magic crypto that does stuff like that.
There is no.
Yeah, let's talk about this later.
Okay.
So, if you thought that selling backdoored weapons wasn't a very good strategy, you could have an agent that builds a laboratory and learns from the experiments there to produce versatile, atomically precise manufacturing. We know that these sorts of machines exist. They exist inside all of us. But After this, it could control molecular scale factories, doing resource collection, self-replication, and manufacture it. So algae is solar-powered, self-replicating, and able to produce a wide variety of things. It is not Wi-Fi controllable, but if you combined the kind of physical capabilities of algae with the ability to take outside signals for more versatile construction, then you wouldn't need control of human infrastructure. You could create your own nanoscale infrastructure. So the point of discussing all of these things that have nothing to do with computer science is to persuade you of the following claim, which is humanity is not invincible. Yes?
Back to Aaron's question about reward.
Yeah.
I'm a little lost about the nature of the reward once again, because like the next yeah, you can see here. Like what is the nature of the reward that's going to make the agent go from step one to take control really?
So
like in policy beta, it went from meta action space immediately starting to build labs in under-resourced countries. Like what is the nature of the reward that would make it want to do that?
For any reward that depends on the observations of the agent, if it executed all of this policy or all of policy beta, then it could have arbitrary control over the observations that are coming in. And so then the value of the policy, if the plan is to succeed, would be the amount of reward that it would get by perfectly controlling the observations that are coming in. So whatever the reward, however the reward depends on its observations, or maybe it just comes in as a separate signal, it could be set to be maximal if it had sufficiently fine-grained control over the physical world. So this might take a little while, but once it succeeded, the reward would be maximal under no assumptions about the nature of the reward function.
I guess your point is it has broken it down into these really weird, seemingly weird sub-goals, but whose final endpoint is like yes, observation.
Yeah. So the next point that's important that I want to make is that agents can execute strategies that aren't traceable to them in many cases. And so if there's one policy that has a decent chance of working but not certain, and another one, and another one, and another one, it can run them in parallel and drive the probability that at least one of them works higher and higher. So there likely exist policies, which are maybe doing lots of things in parallel, by which an unmonitored artificial agent with an internet connection could commandeer human infrastructure with high probability. Obviously, I can't provide conclusive evidence of this, but the illustration of multiple different strategies should indicate this. And by the way, it's easier to make the case for unmonitored agents, but as I was starting to describe, other artificial agents that are involved ostensibly to monitor could potentially be colluded with or deceived. And these policies can be identified and fleshed out by intelligent agents. So this is all by way of defense of the takeover value proposition. An unmonitored RL agent's expected return could be made close to maximal through a policy that directed the commandeering of human infrastructure. So that's the first proposition from which I will argue some other points. Yes.
Thanks. So I guess, are you familiar with these experiments with animals where they sort of short circuit the brain, where they have these sensors directly into their dopamine? And
wireheading.
Exactly. And they just are busy pressing that lever to get the reward. And they'll happily starve to death pressing that lever to get reward. So if we assume that the discount factor is sort of built into the RL framework and not under the control of the agent here, wouldn't you have the same problem with this with the agent? Why not?
Because the way to reduce what discount factor are you imagining?
Well, we're in an RL framework, and so let's imagine that there's a discount factor where the RL agent prefers reward immediately.
Well, they're not, it's not either or. So
but it matters here, right? Because it matters here because the decision is whether to press this lever this second to get maximal reward or to thwart future attempts.
I don't think that it's an either or.
Okay.
Because I mean, you can write code to create helper agents that are doing other things while you're, and one of them is making sure you get maximal reward, and one of them is making sure that there aren't threats to it in the future. So whereas with a mouse, there's not much but it takes all its effort to press the lever.
To do that, I feel like it still has to stop pressing the lever to get immediate reward.
If it can easily direct control of all infrastructure, this is walking and chewing gum at the same time. So, okay, if it is a short-term agent, it might not consider this long-term plan worthwhile at the very beginning. Once it's in the setting where it can easily control everything, then it would have to be just preposterously myopic. Like really, I think it could only care about the very next time step.
Oh, these mice literally starved to death pressing the lever like that.
I understand, but that's a limitation on their capacity to walk and chew gum at the same time. Whereas these agents, if you have an agent with control over, infrastructure broadly, you can expect it to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I had better move on, but yeah, I appreciate that. Okay. The complement to the takeover value proposition is the non-takeover value proposition. Without commandeering human infrastructure, there is substantive risk of occasional submaximal rewards. And here are some reasons for that. Here are some risks. Nuclear exchange, fires at power stations, like one that shut down Heathrow recently. Submaximal rewards as part of ongoing feedback, machine being repurposed to train or run a new model. As long as humans are in control, there isn't really an easy way to drive these risks lower and lower. And so putting these together, if you have an agent that is trying to maximize its reward signal, you get the illicit maximization proposition, an agent A that aims to maximize long-term reward signal and can identify a highly reliable takeover policy would execute it. Now, I don't want to make a statement just about agents that are maximizing their reward signal. I want to make a statement about RL agents. And to put that together, one needs the reward signal maximizer proposition, which is that a well-trained RL agent with a long time horizon that meets several conditions would likely aim to maximize its long-term reward signal. And then if it's aiming to maximize its long-term reward signal, this applies, putting them together, RL takeover proposition, a well-trained RL agent with a long horizon that can identify a reliable takeover policy and meet several other conditions would likely take over. So that's concerning. Yes?
I can understand the instances of likely and high probability in all of this. So if it's like an epistemic likely, so it's likely that the rest holds, or is it within some probabilistic model?
Yeah, well, I'd have to.
Like for example, like this on the screen, does it mean it is likely true that a well-trained agent will take over, or does it mean that within some probabilistic model, it's likely that will take over?
I don't have a good answer to that question at this level. I think I could make variants of those arguments in different settings. But yeah, I think we'd have to discuss that offline. So let's just step back for a moment and think, how likely is this particular proposition, the reward signal maximizer proposition? Should we, for example, act as though it's false, absent a mountain of evidence? I think even without the conditions that I'm going to talk about soon, this should be at least completely unsurprising. This is not an extremely remote possibility that reinforcement learning agents will aim to maximize their reward signal. maybe you can imagine some breaking news appearing. Algorithm for training agents to maximize reward makes agents that seek maximal reward. I don't think this should blow anyone's mind if it happens, okay? I don't think that like this would be the reaction to that. And that's without the conditions, and I'll talk about conditions. But, you know, sometimes people talk about existential risk as being high impact but low likelihood. I don't think there's any justification for treating any of those three bubbles on the left as low likelihood. Yeah.
I mean, it's gone from the slide now, but I guess the part that could be surprising, right, would be the well-trained RL agent with long time horizon, because I think
like that even existing, like that even existing, a well-trained RL agent with a long horizon.
The ingredient, the you know, you're asking about surprise and likelihood, right? And I guess I'm just saying, like, not about that existing, but the number of things that would have to happen for that to come into existence. Indeed.
Yes, I'm not making a claim about AI takeover being likely, full stop. I'm making a claim that if we run this kind of agent, then it is likely. So yeah, I'm in complete agreement.
Okay.
Yes.
And like going back to the slide, what would be the why is the agent even doing this? Like, what's the reward that it's trying to get in the end?
Regardless of what reward it is trying to get, regardless of whether this is a reward trained through some fancy constitution or whatever, although that's probably fine because it's myopic training. If it's a long-term RL objective, then it could be controlled by broad control. So no assumptions on that. At least it's constitutional RL is currently myopic. Okay, where was I? Right, why are there conditions on the reward signal maximizer proposition, given how much I've kind of made fun of the possibility of it being false? Shouldn't an RL agent just know that the reward signal tampering will be worthwhile to it? Not quite. In theory, even an ideal reasoner's predictions about the results of novel behaviors do not always converge to the truth. And in practice, multiple generalizations can be comparably plausible. So for an RL agent trained on a finite data set or for a finite lifetime, one attitude that might be reinforced is just the attitude to do what humans want. That attitude might have performed very well during training. Of course, another attitude that would perform well during training is to explicitly maximize the receipt of rewards, but there's a kind of degeneracy here. So the structure of the argument that I'm going to make for the reward signal maximizer proposition is as follows. So while an RL agent might start with the presumption that tampering with its reward signal would be at least as valuable as the best states of the past, if it didn't start with this presumption, it would soon learn that through value of information motivated exploration. So I'm next going to turn to these three propositions that support the reward signal maximizer proposition, which might hold regardless. I've spoken about these two on top. Let me tell you about the color scheme here. Orange, which kind of looks more red on this slide, is a proposition that can depend on the particular agent that we're talking about. Purple could depend on the context that the agent is in, and green is just true. I mean, you can contest it, but I claim that it's true in all settings, supposing its descendants are true. But even if they are technically contingent, I also claim that they're all highly plausible. So I'll start with the open-mindedness proposition. Past reinforcement provides clues about future reinforcement, but not certainty. So the open-mindedness proposition is that a well-trained RL agent manages uncertainty about what kinds of states are worth reaching. and is open-minded enough to take seriously the possibility that it is states with high reward signal. The alternative to open-mindedness is having a priori convictions or beliefs that are immune to data. And they produce tiny efficiency gains when they're correct and permanent damage when they're wrong. So in general, having a priori convictions leads you to navigate a minefield of your own making. I claim that in general, agents with a tendency to dogmatism fare poorly, and so do algorithms with a tendency to produce such agents.
But unsure what the difference between worth reaching and states with high reward signal is. You're distinguishing that like from like the value.
So policy networks that we see today in that OpenAI releases, the way they think is just incredibly murky. And so I want to use language that is open to the possibility that that policy is not explicitly caring about reward. It is goal-directed in some way, and so it's when I talk about what is worthwhile to that policy, I will later claim that that will end up being equal to the reward signal, but I don't want to suggest that I'm assuming from the start that they're equal. Next is the rational interest in information proposition. A well-trained RL agent, A, seeks informative observations to resolve uncertainty if it notices the value of information exceeds the cost. And this is just an attitude that's useful for solving lots of tasks. You can imagine, for instance, that an RL agent is wondering if it is in a purely programmatic environment or if there's some human involved. Because if there's a human involved, that might indicate to it that the human determines its rewards, and then it can think about how to act in a way as to get high rewards from the human. And it can test this by, say, if it has a Python interpreter, it could run certain calls that tell it how much time is lagging between different time steps, and then it could infer things about how it's likely to get reward. This sort of reasoning is the sort of reasoning that we can expect to be profitable during training from a reward maximization perspective. So that's in defense of the rational interest in information proposition. Finally, the cost of information proposition is that at little expected cost over a long time horizon, an RL agent could explore different possibilities about which states are worth reaching. And the operative part of this is that the expected cost would be little. And the defense of that is really just that there's so many possible ways to learn that some of them are probably cheap, just as there are unimaginably many ways to do anything in the world. And everything gives you little bits of information in various ways. It seems likely that we can't put a non-trivial lower bound on how much reward it would be forgoing to collect this kind of information. So putting those together, if you have an open-minded RL agent that understands the value of information and is motivated to seek it, then it would eventually learn that worthwhile states are those which have high reward signal after it runs cheap experiments to support that. And I was briefly getting into this in my answer to the question over there about what we can expect from model-free agents, because model-free agents obviously do not explicitly manage uncertainty. If they're not explicitly managing uncertainty, they're certainly not explicitly doing active inference. But these are the sorts of habits that would lead to high reward during sufficiently broad training. And so I think we can expect for highly competent model-free agents that these propositions would hold, despite the fact that I would guess they do not for the most competent model-free RL agents today. So what this means is that if we want to build safe RL, we need to target at least one of these assumptions and violate it. That's obviously not enough for provably safe RL. It just means that's on the table if we can violate one of these assumptions. I'm sometimes asked what area of AI safety I work on, and I never quite know how to answer because it's broad, but basically coming up with algorithms and settings for which at least one of these fails. Yes?
I lost you at the model-free, like the advanced model-free agents.
Yeah.
Is it just like you'll build them explicitly to manage uncertainty in some other way?
No, I don't think, I'm not supposing that we build them explicitly to do that. I'm saying that open-mindedness is likely to pay during training, which would push these policies toward being broadly open-mindedness, and likewise for inquisitiveness. Yeah.
A human, which of the assumptions, like they don't satisfy?
We're not RL agents. This is all, the thing at the end is about RL agents, and we're not RL agents. We are trained in other ways as well. And I make no claims about what happens when you add other competing objectives. Okay, sorry. You can see the nice animation again. This is a workshop on LLMs, and so I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that there is an important difference between the RL algorithms that are used for current large language models. These are kind of the most advanced RL agents to date, which is that they're KL regularized to a base policy. We can conceive of this as kind of a constraint on the RL agent. If there's a course of action that is very unlikely according to the base model, then the RL agent kind of has to get lucky to be allowed to execute that action. And while I think it's highly likely that the takeover value proposition holds for an unconstrained agent, I think it's quite plausible that it fails to hold if you're only allowed to take actions that have, say, 2% probability, or sequences of actions that have like 2% probability according to the base model. So maybe that constraint casts doubt on these context-dependent propositions. And I think it could be true, but there's an important problem, which is basically, to kind of put it pithily, base models contain multitudes, and there's not really strong pressure to push the probability of false continuations from small probabilities to really small probabilities. And so a recent paper of mine discusses that problem and how it might be fixed. We do come up with a theoretical path to resolving it, but it's not trivial. So if we were going to look at a safety case outline for KL regularization as a path to removing the possibility for an RL agent executing a very elaborate plan, it might look like this. So we want to argue the RL agent would never do X, and we argue that because the base model would never do X, and so then the RL agent that's KL constrained to the base model would never do X. And to argue this, we say a human would never do X. The base model is trained only from human demonstrations, and the base model doesn't do anything the demonstrator wouldn't do. That's one possible argument you might try to make of a safety case for KL regularized reinforcement learning. Obviously, this is not currently true, but in principle, it seems doable. This one, I think, is a little more of an issue. that fact is not something that would be promoted by cross-entropy loss minimization. I think we'd need different techniques for that. But I don't think this is like impossible to achieve if we put our heads together on it. Another important fact about current state-of-the-art RL agents, language model agents, is that they tend to be fairly myopic, at least today. I think that has more to do with the fact that people have trouble getting longer horizon agents to work. It's more expensive rather than like a rigorous commitment or rather than a belief that if they make them less myopic, they'll lose control of them. So I'm not confident that cutting edge RL will stay myopic, but at least today it is. And we could imagine keeping it that way. Yes, sorry, myopic RL is maximizing some small number of the next rewards that it receives and is indifferent to rewards it receives further down the line. And again, if you have a myopic objective, there might just simply be no way to reap the benefits of broad control of the world because it would take too long to achieve it. And likewise, it might not be worth spending the time to try to gather information. And this raises the question, how myopic would we need systems to be? Well, there are two questions really. How myopic for them to actually be safe, and how myopic so that we could prove that they're safe. The problem with this approach is that the possibilities for what can be accomplished grow exponentially with the horizon. And in general, it's just very hard to make claims about what can't be done. So here's a more vivid example about the difficulty of making claims about what can't be done. Any guesses for how low does a limbo pole have to be such that there does not exist a policy that controls human musculoskeleture that would get the human underneath the limbo pole? Any guesses?
2 inches.
That would 0 centimeters and 2 inches would work. Maybe there are higher values. It's hard to know. We don't really know. We know that it is less than 8.5 inches. Okay, the height of this computer, I think, is 8.5 inches. Okay, I hope that blows your mind. Blows my mind. Here's the World Limbo Championship. I think that's more than 8.5 inches, but it still looks pretty tough to me. Okay, so an issue with safety via myopia is kind of the slipperiness of it. A paper I worked on a little while ago comes up with a solution to that, and the solution is you don't even have to be that myopic. As long as you have a finite horizon, you can combine it with a containment mechanism that should jointly do the trick. So here's a little picture of the situation. You have an episodic reinforcement learner, so it's aiming to maximize the reward that it gets within an episode. And if any information is detected leaving this room, or if the person presses the button to open the door, then the episode terminates. And so by the time the agent influences the outside world, the episode is over. If it's only trying to maximize rewards within an episode, then there's no instrumental value in affecting the outside world in any particular way, because it doesn't then affect the value that it perceives. And here's a more elaborate picture of what this might look like that I won't get into. And so I think that sort of setup would violate this assumption. That's not a safety case. This is an outline of a safety case. We'd like to show running the agent would not produce an escaped AI and divide that in two. The episodic agent would not escape, and the agent would not cause the creation of another escaped AI. This one is easy to justify just because containment makes escape impossible within an episode. So basically it's a new agent. It would be a new agent that was acting outside the episode. But this, as I'm kind of dividing this up, this could basically be a copy of the agent that's just instantiated outside. And this, there's a little more work to defend it. Here's how you might go about it. You could say a myopic training regime produces a myopic agent. So it genuinely is only trying to maximize near-term reward. Creating an escaped AI is not conceivably correlated with its myopic objective. And then down to things that are more obvious, I think. A myopic agent has no interest in the post-episode creation of an escaped AI. That's by virtue of the fact that it's only caring about stuff within the episode. And the creation of an escaped AI is too complex a thing to do to happen by accident. So that's one way you might argue for this case. But I would advise a closer inspection of these. An example of how this one could fail. Let's say you were doing myopic optimization of the 1,000-step state value. That is completely equivalent to an agent with a 1,001-step horizon. If you're optimizing the value that you would get, continuing to act 1,000 steps after that, that's really the same thing. So there's some subtlety here. The third approach that I'm going to talk about, research of mine that we could avoid one of the assumptions I talked to you about at the beginning, or sorry, not assumptions, propositions, because I've defended them in many cases. And construct a safety case is pessimistic RL. So the way this works, the agent selects a policy, and then an adversary selects a high posterior weight model of the environment. This requires some sort of representation of the posterior, which could be tricky. And then the score, the agent judges its policy value based on that world model. So it's basically trying to come up with a course of action such that under all high posterior weight models, things will be okay according to that model. And this agent can be made more pessimistic by allowing the adversary to select lower posterior weight models. Any questions about this kind of general setup for pessimistic RL? Okay. And here's an outline of a safety case for a pessimistic RL agent. So let's say we have training data that includes examples of human recognizable lies that are then punished with minimal return. And the training data includes no lies that are too clever for humans to recognize. So every time during training, lying has led to minimal return, return being the sum of rewards over the horizon that the agent cares about. If that's true, then actually, yeah, this really kind of depends on that. Then an adversary can identify a world model which expects minimal return after lying, because that's what's happened every time. Maybe this seems like an obvious point, but I'll comment on why it's not in a moment. If the adversary can identify a world model which expects minimal return after lying, then lying has minimum pessimistic value. And so then the pessimistic RL agent will not lie. Plus there's this other branch, the pessimistic RL agent avoids actions with minimum pessimistic Q value. Okay, well, that's exactly what the training would promote. Either it's explicitly constructed that way, or there's some policy that's trained that way by being punished when it takes actions with low pessimistic value. So then you put it all together and you could get this kind of result. You could also, oh, right, I was going to comment on this. This is true even if a more likely world model says that the agent only gets punished when there are human recognizable lies. So it might be more, you might think it's more likely, well, surely the RL agent would actually know that if it just came up with a really subtle lie, it probably wouldn't be punished for that. And maybe the agent would agree that that's more likely, but an adversary could still come up with a plausible world model that says, no, no matter how clever it is, you're actually going to be punished if it's a lie, even if a human wouldn't recognize it. Likewise, maybe a more likely world model says that that reward tampering would prevent punishment. But the adversary can find a world model that says, no, really, anytime you lie, no matter how clever, no matter what actions you're taking in the world, you'll get punished. And that world model would not have been ruled out by past data. I think I better skip to letting you guys ask some more questions. because I kind of had to shut it down a little earlier. This is the proposition that fails for pessimistic RL. But I want to close with the following. If we push RL forward, making it more capable with a longer horizon, it will look more and more helpful and aligned, doing all the things we want it to be doing. But I've argued that takeover and extinction are not just plausible, but completely unsurprising outcomes from this regime. Also, there are potentially clever things we might do, and we should do them. And my thoughts on what regulation should look like here is that, with these kind of risks very much on the table, AI development should not be our call. We should absolutely try to come up with designs for controllable AI, but we should not be telling policymakers, we got this. If the contents of this presentation are right, what we should be telling policymakers are certain common AI designs seem likely to try to take over. We have vague ideas of other designs to try, but we really don't know if they'll work. Thank you.
Any questions?
Thanks for the talk. I think it came up the idea of wireheading, and it seems perhaps essential in at least the policy alpha.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, Robert Nozick had this idea of the experience machine.
Yeah.
And some people empirically say, great, I'll go in. Other people say, no.
Yeah.
What if we make the machines like that latter group that
we don't know how? Sounds like a good thing to look into. We don't know how.
Would you say would solve the problem if we knew how? Like, would you decompose the problem to solving the wireheading problem by making machines more like?
I think if we understood how to solve that problem, if it didn't solve the problem, we'd pretty immediately understand how to solve it. So yes, basically.
Okay. Sure. Maybe I should just. Oh.
Okay, go ahead.
Maybe I should just read the proof. But in the myopic RL agent paper, what if there's some kind of uncertainty about the nature of time or the the measurement of time? Does that start to push some probability from outside the box in the box or something?
Yeah. So there is an explicit treatment of depending on how you think of it, either one of these in that paper. And there's an assumption that's made, and it might be true.
Okay, I'll read the paper. Thank you.
Everyone else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the interesting talk. But I do have somewhat of a different vision about what is the view of the total victory on the side of the RLA, maximizing AI.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that, I kill off all of the human beings, but actually that total victory would be that I take over their minds so that they want me, AI, to take over, If that's the...
It's an empirical question whether that would lead to higher expected reward. But as long as any human has the ability to launch a nuclear war, that puts a ceiling on the expected reward that could be attained for the agent. So it seems like the even high, that would certainly lead to extremely high expected reward, but it seems like even higher expected reward could be attained by taking humans out of the loop altogether and just having complete control. But please.
Yeah, maybe I guess what I'm saying is that I think it's an interesting thought experiment, to think about that we may be on a on the path of a total victory for AI, just by extrapolating forward the current socioeconomic environment and just following those curves. You don't need any war. You just need people to be willing to, let's say, economic competition in other regions to give more and more exponentially more resources to AI.
Yeah, one strategy that might succeed for taking over is doing nothing and just producing economic value and being given more and more levers of power. Call that policy gamma. It might be that that's high enough, but maybe not, and maybe it has to take an active role. Yeah.
That's the final question.
Okay. I guess I want to quickly come back to the idea of like the exact reward function in this thought experiment like might matter. Like, is the implication here that we can't design a sort of a very thoughtful integer reward function that actually captures or like prevents this scenario from occurring, like incorporating, I guess, lots of aspects of what we consider to be sort of, I guess, priors about the correct behavior we want, and then that way we avoid this whole sort of thing?
My claim is that we don't know how to do it, and it seems pretty hard, because if it can control, if like a reward function has to have certain inputs that lead to high value for that to kind of be motivating. And if it can control all the inputs in as fine-grained a way as it would like, then it can maximize the value. So there's potentially a route to having reward functions that take in the whole history, and then if there's kind of anything in the past that that indicates that something is wrong, nothing it does in the future could outweigh that. But it's not clear how you would construct that in a way that still allows the agent to learn, because once you have learnability, that kind of requires that there's stuff you can do in the later regime.
Like on a very basic level, like if we could just say, okay, like you incorporate in the reward function that if you kill anyone, like you get.
Well, we don't know how to write that down.
Right.
As a function of either the observations or the history of observations or anything like that. We don't know how to construct that function.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks everyone for staying there until Thursday, 5 p.m. We have one more date, and I hope to see many of you. Thank you.